Today we're going to talk about something that we should have probably talked about at the beginning of the semester, and for many of you this will be review. For others, it'll be a helpful reminder of how to avoid certain mistakes that you continue to make. So the first element we're going to talk about is clauses, which are the building blocks of sentences. So take a second and pause the presentation and consider what you think or how you would define a dependent clause. A dependent clause is one that requires an independent clause in order to be a complete sentence. Usually this is because there's a cue word that sort of sets up the expectation that there will be further information included. Words like since, although, when, for example. And below there's a few examples of dependent clauses that are also incomplete, grammatically incorrect sentences. So although water demand has risen, we're setting up the expectation that there will be a follow-up thought to that. When the creek dries up, if you are searching for samples. These are considered fragments. So you need to add a comma or a connecting word and additional information in order to make these complete. Conversely, an independent clause is one that is a complete sentence, and they can often appear very similar to dependent clauses, but they don't have that expectation set up of more information. So we could make all of the previous examples complete sentences and independent clauses by simply crossing out the first word. Water demand has risen. The creek dries up. You are searching for samples. These are all viable sentences. The other building blocks for sentences are the parts of speech that make them up, that constitute them. So we've got two parts of speech that are absolutely critical to every sentence. That is a subject and a verb. The subject can take the form of a noun, a pronoun, or a proper noun. It could be yourself, for example. And then verbs often come in many forms, from to be verbs such as is and are and will, to more action-oriented verbs, causative verbs, modal verbs, like we talked about a few weeks ago. And one of the biggest rules is that these two must agree in form. So the rest of this topic today is going to be devoted to agreement, that it must appear within sentences. So there are lots of ways that elements of sentences must agree. The biggest one we'll talk to today is between subject and verb. And there are also agreement requirements for time, so we have to make sure we're discussing what happens versus in the past versus the present and the future correctly. And in lists, we often have to set up our items in our list correctly, both in terms of tenses and parallelism, which means the types of words that we're using. And then finally, pronouns. So we need to apply the right gender pronouns where appropriate, and then people pronouns versus object pronouns. So let's move into subject-verb agreement. The basic premise is that if a subject is singular, the verb is usually singular. Singular verbs usually end in the letter S, which might seem counterintuitive, since when we have a plural noun, that usually means adding an S. But in this case, this is how it works. So just be cued that verbs that end in S are typically singular. And if the subject is plural, similarly, we need a plural verb. So examples are, they collect water samples from the river. So they is a plural subject. Collect is a plural version of the verb. Versus she collects water samples from the river. So she is a singular subject, and collects is the singular version of that verb. There is a major exception, however, to that rule, which is the first person and second person, even though they are singular, use plural verbs. First person is I, me, writing from your own perspective. Second person is when you use the you. So when you're commanding someone to do something or describing what someone will do, some instructions, for example, these perspectives both require plural verbs. So I research water conservation versus she researches water conservation. You recommend fewer water diversions versus he recommends fewer water diversions. So always remember the first, second person exception. There are also a lot of tricky cases with subject-verb agreement. One is to look out for a number of words that might come in between a subject and a verb, which might confuse you as to what the subject actually is. An example would be, one of those rivers has declined significantly. Sorry, ignore the is and are in there, that's a mistake. But the point is that you might be mistaken and think that rivers is the subject, and that would require have, the plural version of the verb. But the true subject is actually one, which requires the singular verb, which is has. Another example, the people who reside in Hyderabad are often threatened by floods. Again, we're talking about people, which is a plural subject, multiple persons, not Hyderabad, for example. Another tricky case is sometimes you will have multiple subjects. If these subjects are joined by and, if there are two or more of them, you always require a plural verb accordingly. So Bugra and Smith state that the results are inconclusive. However, don't be fooled if the subject is, or if the two subjects or more than two subjects are joined by the word or instead of an, then it is singular subject, so you need a singular verb. A biologist or an ecologist has the potential to add a new perspective to our research. This is sort of an exception, sort of also just another tricky case. It is the case of indefinite pronouns. These are words like everybody, somebody, anybody, none, everyone, which refer to a collective, many people at once, or a hypothetical person, or no people, and these are all treated as singular subjects. So everyone does homework, versus the people, for example, from our last example, as a plural subject would be the people do homework. Or students do their homework. So just remember that all of these pronouns, indefinite pronouns, are singular and require singular verbs. Another similar but tricky case are collective pronouns. These are words that refer to definitive amounts of multiple subjects. So while words like everyone are more hypothetical, all refers more to a set amount of people in a place, every single person that is there. Few, a few people, several people, both people, for example. These are all plural subjects and require plural verbs accordingly. So now we'll move on to tense agreement. Obviously, in sentences, we can have complex situations where we're talking about things that happen in the past that maybe trigger something in the present or the future, but everything must be logical. So here's an example of something that is incorrect. The city floods when the levees broke. This doesn't make sense because we're saying the city is flooding in the present tense of flood, when the levees broke is happening in the past. And so the way that this is accounted for doesn't make sense because we either need to have the city flooded when the levees broke, so this event happened in the past, it was triggered by something in the past, or it's more of a present tense situation describing something that could happen at any time. The city floods when the levees break. So that you just need to make sure that everything is logical in terms of causation and tenses in your sentences. Another example, these often come up in lists, so we want to make sure every item in a list aligns in terms of chronology. So we collected, labeled, and analyzed the samples. This is incorrect. We can either make it all past or present tense as we did before. We collected, labeled, and analyzed the samples, or we collect, label, and analyze the samples. If you wanted to say that you collected and labeled them in the past and are analyzing them presently, you would need to reconstruct the sentence. So you could say, we collected and labeled the samples and are now analyzing them, or and will now analyze them. So that's a way to change it so that you can distinguish between past and present, but the list must be broken up in that case. Another issue with lists, which we talked about when we discussed flow in writing, is making sure that all the items in the list are similar in terms of parts of speech. That is either compound nouns or compound verbs or just simple verbs or simple nouns. So a bad example is in order to improve wash facilities, we recommend daily cleaning, hand sanitizers, and polling the local communities. So while daily cleaning and hand sanitizer dispensers are either nouns or compound nouns, polling the local communities is set up as a compound verb. Polling is set up as a verb in this case. So to correct that, we could say we recommend daily cleaning, hand sanitizer dispensers, and community polling, which turns that into a compound noun. Or we could say we recommend cleaning daily, installing hand sanitizer dispensers, and polling the community, turning each of those items into a compound verb. And finally, we also need to have agreement with our pronouns. One of the aspects of this is just using the correct gender. That is straightforward enough, although in today's world it has become more complicated because we're supposed to ask everyone their desired pronouns. You may have heard that before, so that we make sure we're using the right ones and not working off assumptions. And the other part of this is more indefinite pronouns, which can be either people-specific or more non-person object-specific. And the rule is that if you're talking about a person, you want to use people-specific pronouns such as who or whom, versus if you're talking about objects or even animals, we want to use non-person pronouns such as that, which, it, and this. That might seem counterintuitive for animals because obviously they're gendered, so that can be personal preference of the author as long as you're consistent, but the official rule is that you are supposed to refer to animals like objects, so that, which, it, this, regardless of gender. So a wrong example would be, Dr. Bashir, which studied at Mehran University, leads the project. What's wrong with this sentence? We're using which instead of who, referring to Dr. Bashir as a non-person. To correct this, we would simply replace the word which with who. Dr. Bashir, who studied at Mehran University, leads the project. And now we are in good shape. So that's it for agreement. Hopefully this was helpful, just reminding you of the rules and tricky cases to look out for, especially as you go revise your theses drafts and your business plans, to look out for these types of errors, which can be easy to make in certain situations. I'm sorry I couldn't make it today, but please let me know if you have questions. You can email me or text me, and if any of this content is unclear, you can let me know. We can also discuss next week. Good luck.